Greetings, everyone. Neal here from the Garrett Public Library for this week's Railroader Reading. I hope all of you have had a good week. September, once upon a time, was the beginning of the school year, when teachers would assign either a paper or just us getting up and telling about what we'd done over the summer vacation. I've selected an excursion by author Danny Pelligrino from his book, How Do I Unremember This? And I'll be trimming it down some. The author grew up in Salon, Ohio, just outside of Cleveland. Danny wrote a prior chapter to my selection about his father waiting until the day before to buy a new, larger vehicle for the family of 5. As a clue to how this will go, the first one was too long for the garage, and in a final tirade started removing wall cabinets to try and make it fit, until defeated. He had to go get another vehicle. Vacation day 1. With a brand new, used van ready to take us to Florida, the Pellegrino family finally loaded our luggage the next morning. While Mom was happy it was big and still fit in the garage, it didn't have the fancy rack on top for the bags like she hoped for. So we had to carefully Tetris our stuff in the trunk in order for everything to fit. Dad and Brian prided themselves in utilizing the space to the best of their abilities, and somehow they got all the sausage into the casing. If you've never been inside an Astrovan, you should know that there are usually 3 rows of seats: the driver passenger, then 2 other rows in the back. For ours, the middle row of seats was removed before we even hit the road, so that we could put pillows and blankets down and sleep on the way. With no proper seating in the back, at any given moment on the ride to Florida, there were 3 people shuffling around the floor of a van without a seat belt or anything to keep them in place. Whenever we hit a speed bump, my tiny child body would fly to the air like I was on a traveling trampoline. Dad thought he was doing us a solid after the Caprice debacle by giving us extra space to sprawl around, but maybe we should have had actual seats with seat belts. Not only did Dad get us the big van and not make us wear seat belts, but he also bought a tiny television set with a VCR attached. Kids today don't understand how high-tech this was. Watching movies in a moving vehicle wasn't commonplace. This was years before headrests turned into DVD players or cell phones could play episodes of Euphoria, and we thought it was very luxe to sit on the floor of our new van and watch a movie on a 4-inch screen while my loving maniac of a father got us to Orlando. The movies we brought along were family favorites on VHS, like My Cousin Vinny, Sister Act 2, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. My Cousin Vinny isn't exactly family friendly, but it was my dad's fave. And Marissa Tomei made my mom laugh, so she allowed it. There are a lot of F-bombs in the movie, but no more than my dad used when talking about the man who built our house, whom he didn't even know personally. My parents didn't believe in staying anywhere overnight along the way, since it was more costly, so we drove the entire distance, only stopping for food and gas. Even though no one else other than my dad was equipped to drive, Mom refused because it was a big Astrovan without seat belts for her children, and my brothers weren't old enough to drive yet. So that meant Dad was behind the wheel for 18 plus hours, or so we thought. Whenever I see family road trips in movies, the wife is riding passenger, but Linda was not interested in even being up front, acting as the human navigation. She wanted to lie in back and nap in between viewings of the Sister Act films. Brian was the most obedient of us, so Dad convinced him to help direct him while riding passenger. Back then there was no Google Maps or MapQuest or TomTom, so Brian had a giant paper map that was bigger than he was. Dad also had a fancy radar detector that was supposed to beep every time we were near the police, so he could slow down and drive the speed limit. But that soon went out the window. About an hour into the drive, it wouldn't stop beeping. So Dad did throw it out the window and Brian had to act as a Foley artist, making noises if he saw a speed gun or anything that resembled the car that didn't fit in our garage the night before. I know I said my dad was piloting for 18 plus hours, but it's time I live with my truth. I have a vivid memory of that specific road trip that comes to me at random. It was the wee hours, and everyone in back was snoozing. The car swerved, and my tiny body slid across the floor of the van, abruptly waking me up. My eyes opened, and I wondered if we had arrived in Florida. I heard a familiar snoring, but my mom and Junior were both quiet sleepers, so I knew it wasn't them. The loud snores came from up front. I looked at the culprit in the passenger seat. It was Dad. So by now you're probably wondering who was driving. I was too. Before I could do the math, I heard my 12-year-old brother, "Go to sleep, Danny." Brian was behind the wheel, with my mom and dad off in dreamland. "Why are you driving?" I asked him in a whisper. Brian was wildly offended. "Dad was teaching me how to drive. Now shut up and go back to bed." "But Dad's asleep," I replied. "You should be too," Brian instructed. But my line of questioning was distracting him from the task at hand, and he briefly found himself driving on the wrong side of the road. He swerved to get us back on track, and fortunately, the sudden movement didn't wake up any of the others, although Dad shifted a bit in the passenger. "Go back to sleep. You're annoying me," he exclaimed. I drifted off to bed, and my eyes wouldn't open until the next morning. The sun rose, and I too began to awaken. As I put my glasses on, I saw that Dad was back in the driver's seat as if nothing had happened. How long was my 12-year-old brother leading us to Florida? Mom couldn't believe how chipper Dad was the next day, and they were laughing and making cute jokes with each other all morning as we entered the Florida state limits. "Normally, you're cranky if you don't get enough sleep," I overheard Mom say to Dad. "Vacation is all about relaxing," he said calmly, as if he'd unlocked the secret to a successful trip. "It must have been a bumpy road because I felt like I rocked to sleep," she said. Dad was only happy because he'd gotten a few solid hours of Z's. Brian, on the other hand, was grumpier than usual. Instead of sleeping like the rest of us, he drove from Savannah to Jacksonville without any conscious company. And when Dad finally did come to, Brian was forced to direct him again and keep an eye out for the popo. When we finally arrived at our destination, Mom and Dad instructed us to stay in the car while they checked us in at the hotel office. There was an office in one location, and down the road in a separate building were the rooms that the guests stayed in. Holding our room key and a flower pot with a gator and a flamingo holding hands on it, which Mom gripped proudly, the check-in office had a little gift shop, and she saw a pot she liked quite a bit. So she splurged and bought it. The night prior was so chaotic, and the drive so long, she wanted to treat herself now that she assumed the fun part of the vacation was about to start. Once we arrived in our designated spot, Dad opened the back of the van and started to unpack the luggage immediately, even before checking out our new digs. The baggage had fit perfectly in the van, so emptying it became a strategic game to ensure things didn't fall out willy-nilly. Just as we got the last of the gear out of the trunk, we heard a scream. Mom noticed the window of our hotel room was shattered, looking like someone had broken in, so we wouldn't be staying there after all. That meant the belongings my dad just carefully unloaded would now have to return to the trunk. Packing the van for the first time not only took him about an hour, but it also took a lot of concentration. He was lacking the patience and demeanor to do it for a second time after such a long road trip. "Should have gotten the cargo carrier," Mom said under her breath, but purposely loud enough for everyone to hear. Dad pulled everything out of the trunk again and started over, his temper now flaring as he tried to repack the luggage of 5 people. Ordinarily, he would have reached for a smoke, but Mom wouldn't let him pack his cigarettes on the trip, encouraging him to quit over the relaxing vacation. "Get in the van. I'll load it myself," he told us. We all knew that meant everyone except Brian should go back into the vehicle. My mom set down her new flower pot alongside the luggage outside the van and settled in while Dad and Brian took care of it. I continued to watch them through the window as they tried to fit everything, this time seemingly finding more success than the last effort. And pretty soon, everything was loaded in other than my mom's new souvenir flower pot. I watched as Brian handed it to Dad to pack in, but without missing a beat, Dad tossed it into a nearby trash can, shattering it to pieces, before he slammed the trunk closed and got back in the driver's seat. "I threw away your ceramic tub," he announced glibly as he put the keys into the ignition, not thinking it was of any real importance. "My what?" Mom asked. And I think you know how the rest of that conversation will go. No one else said a word as we pulled back into the hotel check-in office parking lot, ready to exchange the keys and get a new room. Dad went in while Mom waited in the van with us, arms crossed, and no stress wine for her to grab a hold of. After a few minutes, he exited the office with a pamphlet and a brand new flower pot. Only this pot was bigger and shinier than the one that was shattered near our previously booked room, albeit without the animals on it. I assumed Dad booked us a new room at the same hotel, but I was wrong. Instead, we hit the open road. Dad glanced at his pamphlet while the rest of us sat exhausted at what was the start of our family trip, quietly looking out the windows and wondering how we would all survive the next few days with each other. A few minutes later, we pulled into a resort that looked way choicer than that other place we were planning to stay. Mom looked at the family she loved more than anything, the kids who were already exhausted, and the husband she so carefully chose to spend the rest of her life with. And she realized that a family vacation isn't about having fun or recharging your batteries. It's about finding the little victories on the way to the finish line. It's about getting through the journey alongside the ones you love. Well, for the time being, we are finished with that story. Another staff member will be back next week for another great read. And I shall say so long for now, until the next time we virtually meet.